Good afternoon, everyone. Today we're doing a painting of a bird on a branch winter scene, but we're going to start with practicing some technique, a drill to help us get used to a certain way of working with watercolor. This technique is called dry into wet. Two brushes, a large brush and a small brush, and we're going to use one color to begin with, a simple neutral tint. I use neutral tint. You could use black or you could use sienna or whatever you like. Very, very weak, diluted with a lot of water. And to prepare for this, I actually used two puddles, one very weak and one medium strength, which was more like a thicker paint. I start with that big wet wash, which is very diluted. And then this first tree that I painted on the right was done with a medium strength wash. And the second one, I added a bit more pigment to it to get a stronger wash. And now I'm using even stronger dark, very thick paint to paint this last pine tree. All three are pine trees, the difference being the size and the consistency of the paint that I'm using. So in this exercise, it's designed to familiarize us with how paint consistency translates into a tonal value, a light or a dark. The virtue of working this way is that you maintain soft edges all the way through, and you can create atmospheres this way and depth this way. So, I'm adding a bit of salt to the painting. How fun is that? Let's see what happens as it dries. We're going to do this same exercise now with two colors. A light puddle of ultramarine blue, a light puddle of burnt sienna mixed loosely on the brush. I'm creating the background first, very, very wet. I'm using a big brush to do this so that I can really saturate the page. That's what you want to do. If it should start to dry out while you're painting, use a mister to kind of keep it wet and active. So I'm doing the same thing. I've got a medium strength ultramarine blue, a medium strength burnt sienna. I'm mixing them on the page or loosely on the brush, trying to get that first tree in the distance like I did with the neutral tint. The second tree, done the same way, mixing burnt sienna, ultramarine blue on the brush. Again, this is I've added some pigment now to that puddle so that it's a bit stronger. And this helps to create that shape of the tree. It doesn't all spread out. The third version, or the bigger tree that we're painting now, is done with almost full strength ultramarine blue and burnt sienna on the brush. It helps in this technique to squirt out a bit of fresh color before you start so that it's not so challenging to mix them as you're painting. And what you'll notice happen, what you can see happening is that the paint starts to separate a little bit and you get an interesting variety of color as a result of that exercise. Paint is still a little wet in this tree here. It's damp, it's not glistening, and I'm showing you how you can lift a little bit with a knife or other sharp object. If you want to create something in front of that, you can remove a little color. It's got to be done at the right time, which means the paper has lost its glisten but is still very damp. So this is an exercise in timing as well. We painted these trees while the paper was wet, and we wanted to have it wet be throughout, so we had to perhaps work a little faster than we're accustomed to. But this will build a sense of timing into your technique, and you'll begin to sense how wet the paper needs to be. So let's extend this into a painting. We're going to use this technique, especially in the background of this painting. This is an image that I found online. And I looked at it and thought this would work well for the particular technique that we're using today. It's a copyrighted image. You can see the watermark. But for an exercise as we're doing, having a good image source is helpful. So you look at the background, you see all those soft, rich darks. That's where we're going to utilize this technique. I start with a very light wash, kind of placing my main figure. I want to indicate some bright snow where I'm not going to be using this wash, primarily on the right side, maybe a little drawing for branches. This is just to kind of set the composition and help me establish where my light dry areas will be. I'm using the burnt sienna, the ultramarine blue in the same manner, big brush, but what I've done here is I've compartmentalized the painting, which is an important strategy for the watercolors, being able to see their painting in terms of stages or areas that they can manage. This helps me to keep that area wet longer. If I work above the branch, as I'm doing now, work above the branch, I can manage this area much more easily than if I were trying to manage the whole painting at once. So this branch coming across horizontally provides a bit of relief, and I'm utilizing that. What you see me doing now is working into the wet painting with a combination of burnt sienna, ultramarine blue, both on the brush at the same time, and creating these soft darks that are in the background. I'm careful not to get careful to keep the painting wet. I need to spray it once in a while, but overall, I was able to effectively place those darks above. Now what I'm doing is returning to the painting with the same light mixture, and have a look at how I finished those branches. I left some whites of the paper. This I will utilize later on. But I want to point that out at this stage because I keep them white. I don't like to use masking. I like to see the whites so I can measure my darks. Working into the painting now with the smaller brush, I make the jump from the big brush to the smaller brush when I'm applying these midtones or these darks into the wet area. It just helps you to control the moisture a lot more. And you can shape them, you can add another color, a little bit of a different wash. While it's very wet, in other words, while it's glistening, you can effectively, add color, remove color, shift color without it really becoming muddy. This is as long as it's glistening. Once it starts to lose its glisten, it becomes very fragile. The watercolor becomes very fragile, and you have to be careful about what you do. So the background is relatively complete. What I'm doing now is some dry brush to simulate a branch, create a branch running through a snowy area. So I'm utilizing some of that left paper to put a few branches around it and make it feel like the branches are supporting the snow. The same is true for those little tiny whites that I left as I was dragging the wash downward on the on the lower section. I left some whites, if you remember. You can see how I'm working around them and running branches underneath them to finish this idea that there's a little snow on the branch. I find this an effective way to paint. Those whites were left randomly. I didn't really try to match the image source too much. In fact, the image doesn't have those little areas of snow on the branches. Those are added. This is where the branches connect to the tree. There's a lot of interesting line work and deep darks that run under the snow and eventually support our bird. I believe it's a robin. Must have been a spring snow because they really don't show themselves too much until the spring around here. But that red breast gives it away. This is the one exception to the two-color painting that we're going to use here. We just can't resist that bright red, and it sets off the bird in a nice way. It provides just a little bit of extra color relief. And he's our main character. We've got to give him a little something extra. So why not show off that red color as much as we can? I'm trying to be very economical with my strokes. Think about how I can use as few as possible and still get the shape of the bird because that always looks good in the end. When it dries, it has a strength to it that you can't get if you're continually reshaping and using small strokes to create it. Some smaller details, all with a small brush now. I'm adding berries and little tiny branches, accents, and these reds that we used in the breast of the robin, we can extend to the berries and create some unity there. So the painting is nearing a finished state. You know, we have to put his eye in, the all-important eye. Gives the bird focus, and we feel it's a living creature now. And a few more light touches. It's nice to balance the painting at this point with the color. And you can see here's the finished piece and how it's dried. That soft area that we worked hard to create is working. It's receding. Our bird is sitting on the branch, and a nice winter scene.